In the sleepy town of Corval, not much ever seemed to happen, except, of course, if one listened to the old-timers who sat on the porches of their weather-beaten homes, sharing tales that weren't meant for the faint-hearted. These were stories of shadows that whispered, winds that knew your name, and lights that flickered with the presence of those long gone. The tale I'm about to share begins on a crisp, October evening, the kind where the sunset bleeds red into the horizon and the promise of winter whispers through the falling leaves. Emily, a curious journalist with a penchant for the supernatural, had recently arrived in Corval, drawn by rumors of the unexplained and the history of forgotten lore. She rented a small, quaint cottage that locals claimed belonged to the infamous Madame Nell, a supposed witch who vanished under mysterious circumstances decades ago. The cottage was nestled at the edge of the woods, where the trees stood so tall and so thick one could easily forget the existence of the outside world. Emily loved it for this very reason. It was the perfect setting for her next big story. On her first night, as she unpacked her belongings, the air grew inexplicably cold, and a soft, sorrowful melody seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls. Intrigued, Emily followed the sound, tracing it to an old, dust-covered piano in the attic. The music stopped abruptly as she approached, and in the eerie silence that followed, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Days passed, and Emily immersed herself in the town's history, interviewing residents and gathering tales of ghostly sightings and unexplainable events. Each person she spoke to mentioned the attic piano, always with a note of fear in their voices. They spoke of a young woman, Eliza, who had once lived there, her life as mysterious as her death was unexplained. They said her spirit still lingered, forever bound to her beloved piano. One night, driven by a mix of dread and excitement, Emily set up her recording equipment in the attic, determined to communicate with whatever spirits resided there. As the clock struck midnight, she asked, "Eliza, are you there?" The air thickened, the temperature dropped, and then, a single, haunting note resonated from the piano. "Yes," a voice whispered, so faintly it was almost lost in the rustling of the trees outside. "What do you want?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Play," the voice replied, and the piano keys began to depress on their own, playing a melancholic tune that made Emily's heart ache with an inexplicable sadness. Over the next few days, Emily visited the attic every night, communicating with Eliza, learning her story piece by piece. Eliza spoke of a hidden truth, a betrayal that tethered her to this world. She revealed that only by uncovering the truth about her death could she be freed. Driven by a newfound purpose, Emily scoured the town archives, piecing together old property records, personal diaries, and forgotten letters. Her search led her to an old, crumbled letter tucked away in the pages of a library book, dated back to the year Eliza died. The letter was from Eliza to her sister, confessing her fears about someone she once trusted. The letter ended abruptly, with a smudge of ink and a sense of urgency. Realizing the key to Eliza's unrest might lie with this mysterious figure, Emily decided to confront the descendants of the oldest families in Corval. One by one, they denied knowledge of any wrongdoing, but their eyes often darted away, holding secrets too painful or dangerous to reveal. As October waned and the nights grew longer, Emily knew she was close to uncovering something monumental. On the eve of Halloween, she arranged to meet with Mr. Hawthorne, the eldest living descendant of the town's founding family. Known for their reclusiveness and rumored dark history, the Hawthorne family had always intrigued Emily. Mr. Hawthorne agreed to meet at his ancestral home, a looming, decrepit mansion that overlooked the town. As Emily approached, the mansion seemed to groan under the weight of its own secrets, the windows flickering with shadows that weren't entirely caused by the dying light. Inside, Mr. Hawthorne awaited, his figure almost blending into the dark tapestries that adorned the walls. His voice was gravelly as he spoke. "I've been expecting you, Miss Emily. You're meddling in things you don't understand." His warning was stern, but Emily's resolve was stronger. "I need to know about Eliza," she demanded, her recorder capturing every moment. "What happened to her?" Mr. Hawthorne sighed, a sound of resignation escaping him as he motioned towards an old oil painting of a beautiful young woman with sad eyes. "Eliza was a beacon of light in a time of darkness," he began, his voice a mixture of sorrow and fear, "but light often attracts darkness." He revealed a chilling tale of love, betrayal, and a curse that had ensnared not just Eliza, but the entire Hawthorne lineage. The truth was more horrifying than Emily could have imagined, intertwining the fate of the town with the restless spirits that haunted it. As Mr. Hawthorne recounted the last, desperate days of Eliza's life, the air around them grew cold, and the shadows seemed to stir, as if the mansion itself was reliving its tragic past. Emily listened, horrified and fascinated, as each piece of the puzzle fell into place, revealing a story that would shake the foundations of Corval. But just as Mr. Hawthorne was about to disclose the final, most crucial piece of the mystery, the lights flickered violently, and a chilling scream echoed through the halls, cutting him off. The recorder fell to the ground, its batteries drained, and in the darkness, Emily felt the overwhelming presence of something ancient and angry. As the scream faded into a sinister silence, Emily's heart pounded against her chest. The darkness around her was oppressive, thick enough to suffocate. The chilling sensation of unseen eyes watching her every move made her skin crawl. She fumbled in her bag, hands shaking, as she searched for her flashlight. Once found, she clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. The light revealed Mr. Hawthorne's pale face, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored her own. "What was that?" Emily's voice was a whisper, afraid that anything louder might provoke another scream. "That," Mr. Hawthorne paused, swallowing hard, his gaze fixed on a point over Emily's shoulder. "That was her, Eliza. She knows you're close to uncovering her story. She's restless, more now than ever." Emily turned slowly, her flashlight sweeping the room. The walls, adorned with aged portraits and tapestries, seemed to close in on her, the faces in the paintings watching, their expressions twisted in silent screams and somber frowns. "But why? Why does she scream?" "It's the curse," Mr. Hawthorne replied, his voice a mere breath as he moved to a large bookcase. He pulled at a book, and the case creaked open, revealing a hidden passage. "This way. We need to be somewhere safe to continue." With no other option, Emily followed him into the narrow passage. The air was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and decay. The walls were lined with cobwebs, and the faint sound of something scurrying in the darkness sent shivers down her spine. They descended a narrow set of stairs, the wood groaning under their weight, until they arrived at a small, dimly lit room. This was Eliza's sanctuary, Mr. Hawthorne explained as he lit a few candles. The room was simple, with a small writing desk, a faded rug, and a large window that looked out onto the overgrown garden. She spent her last days here, writing, playing music, trying to find peace. Emily's eyes scanned the room, stopping at the desk where a dusty journal lay open. She approached it slowly, her fingers tracing the worn cover before flipping through the pages. The entries were a mix of beautiful cursive and frantic scrawls, a testament to Eliza's deteriorating state of mind. She was scared, Emily murmured, reading about shadows watching from the corners and whispers in the dark. Yes, and with good reason, Mr. Hawthorne added, watching her closely. The person she trusted, the person who betrayed her, it was my great-grandfather. He loved her, or so he claimed. But he coveted her talents, her connection to the spiritual realm, more than her heart. Did he kill her? Emily's voice was steady, despite the fear that clutched at her throat. We never found her body, he admitted, his eyes darkening. But it's believed that he trapped her soul here, in this house, using a dark ritual written in this very journal. The revelation was horrifying, and Emily felt a deep, searing anger on Eliza's behalf. She wanted to help, to free Eliza's spirit from the chains of betrayal and malice that bound her. What can we do? There is a way, but it's dangerous, Mr. Hawthorne cautioned. It involves reliving that night, uncovering the truth in its entirety. We must recreate the ritual, reverse it. Emily nodded, determination setting in. Tell me what to do. They spent hours poring over the journal, deciphering the cryptic notes and instructions. Outside, the wind howled, the old house creaking and groaning as if protesting their plans. As they prepared, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the shadows in the corners of the room seeming to move just beyond the reach of the candlelight. Finally, they were ready. Mr. Hawthorne drew a circle on the floor with salt and placed candles at specific points around it. Emily stood in the center, holding Eliza's journal against her chest. Now, Mr. Hawthorne instructed, read the incantation aloud, and whatever happens, do not step out of the circle. Her voice shaky, Emily began to read. The words felt heavy on her tongue, a language she didn't understand but felt compelled to speak. As she spoke, the candles flickered wildly, the shadows danced, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that her breath fogged in the air. Then, the whispers started. Soft at first, so soft she thought she might have imagined them, but they grew louder, a cacophony of voices that filled the room, filled her mind, screaming, pleading, crying. She wanted to cover her ears, to scream herself, but she kept reading, the words of the incantation her only anchor in the chaos that swirled around her. "Keep going," Mr. Hawthorne shouted over the noise, his face tense with fear and hope. Emily continued, the final words of the ritual coming out as a desperate cry. And then, everything stopped. The silence was abrupt, oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. And in that silence, they waited, hearts pounding, breaths held. What they had unleashed, what they had hoped to fix, hovered in the balance, the outcome uncertain. In the oppressive silence that followed the ritual, Emily and Mr. Hawthorne stood frozen, their eyes scanning the dimly lit room for any sign of change, any indication that their efforts had reached beyond the veil to touch the spectral world. The candlelight cast long, flickering shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Emily's heart beat so loudly, she was sure it echoed off the walls, a staccato rhythm in the quiet of the haunted room. They approached the pedestal cautiously, the air around them growing colder, the shadows deeper. The book seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Emily reached out, her hand shaking, to open the cover, but Mr. Hawthorne stopped her. "We must be careful," he cautioned, his voice low. "This book holds great power, power that is not easily controlled. We need to understand what we are dealing with before we act." Together, they began to sift through the other items in the room, looking for anything that might help them understand how to safely handle the book, how to untangle the web of magic and malice that had been woven so long ago. As they worked, the shadows in the room seemed to move, to stretch towards them, as if the darkness itself was alive, aware of their presence, and not pleased by their intrusion. Amid the ancient artifacts and withering pages of forgotten lore, Emily and Mr. Hawthorne continued their meticulous search, their every movement accompanied by the oppressive presence of the darkness that seemed almost sentient, as if the shadows themselves were breathing along the dusty shelves. The lantern light flickered erratically, casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls, creating fleeting, grotesque shapes that twisted in the corners of Emily's eyes, causing her to look back repeatedly, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and anticipation. The room was cold, so cold that each breath they exhaled formed a ghostly mist that hung in the air before them. The silence was punctuated only by the soft rustle of old paper and the distant, almost inaudible moan that seemed to seep through the very walls of the house. This moaning, a sorrowful lament, grew louder as Emily approached a particularly ancient shelf tucked away in the darkest corner of the room. Here, she discovered a series of parchments, their edges brittle and curled with age, the writing upon them faded to nearly illegible. But with careful handling and the aid of the flickering lantern light, she was able to decipher the text, which appeared to be a diary or journal of some sort. The entries were chaotic, filled with ramblings about the shadows that whisper and the lights that deceive. These phrases were repeated over and over, alongside sketches of strange symbols and diagrams that seemed to correlate with the positioning of the stars and moon. "Look at this," Emily whispered to Mr. Hawthorne, handing him a particularly fragile page that seemed to have been torn from the journal in haste. The entry described a ritual, similar to the one they had performed earlier, but far more complex and evidently dangerous. It spoke of a binding of spirits and the anchoring of souls, practices that were meant to contain and control the paranormal entities that had plagued the house for centuries. As Mr. Hawthorne read over the text, his face grew increasingly pale. This could be what we need to break the curse, he said, though his voice trembled, betraying his uncertainty. But the risks, Emily, the risks are immense. We could be unleashing something far worse than what we've already encountered. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. The weight of their discovery bore down on her, heavy with potential disaster, but she knew they had no choice. "We have to try," she said firmly. "We owe it to Eliza, and to all the others trapped here." Together, they began to gather the materials listed in the journal. This included a variety of herbs and incense, several precisely cut crystals, and a small, silver knife with an intricately carved handle that Emily found wrapped in a velvet cloth. Each item was placed carefully around the room, forming a circle around the Book of Shadows, which lay ominously silent on the stone pedestal. Then, slowly, a figure began to materialize in the center of the circle. It was faint at first, so ethereal that Emily thought her eyes were playing tricks on her in the dim light. But gradually, the figure became clearer, a woman, dressed in a flowing gown that swayed as if caught in a gentle breeze. Her hair was long, cascading down her shoulders in waves, and her face was sorrowful yet beautiful, marked by the passage of time and the weight of untold stories. It was Eliza, as real and as unreal as the moonlight through the mist. "Eliza?" Emily's voice broke the silence, a whisper of hope tinged with uncertainty. The apparition turned slowly, her eyes meeting Emily's, deep and endless pools of sadness and knowledge. "You have freed me," she said, her voice like the wind through the leaves, but not completely. Her gaze was penetrating, looking through Emily, beyond her, into the depths of her soul. "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her brow furrowed in confusion and concern. "There is more," Eliza replied, her voice a soft murmur, echoing strangely in the cramped room. "My story is but one thread in the tapestry of this place. The curse that bound me here, it binds others, too, others who were wronged, who suffered fates like mine or worse." Mr. Hawthorne stepped forward, his expression serious, marked by the gravity of their situation. "How do we free them? How do we break the curse completely?" Eliza's eyes seemed to glow with an inner light as she spoke. "You must find the source, the heart of the curse. It lies deep within this house, buried beneath layers of deceit, pain, and darkness. You must uncover it, confront it, and only then can you end it. But how? Where do we even begin?" Emily's voice was tense, her mind racing with the implications of Eliza's words. "In the beginning," Eliza said, pointing to the old bookcase that hid the passage they had come through. "Start where the darkness was born." With that, her figure began to fade, dissolving into the air like smoke, her last words hanging in the room, a charge, a mission for those she left behind. Emily and Mr. Hawthorne exchanged a look, a mix of fear and determination. Without another word, they turned to the bookcase, pushing it aside to reveal not just the passage they had entered through but another, hidden compartment, a narrow, dusty staircase spiraling down into the darkness. Taking only a moment to gather a lantern and some old, heavy cloaks to protect against the chill, they began their descent. The stairs were narrow and creaked ominously under their weight. Cobwebs brushed against their faces, and the air grew colder, damper, as they went deeper underground. The staircase ended in a long, narrow corridor, its walls lined with ancient portraits, eyes seeming to follow their every move. At the end of the corridor, a large, iron-bound door loomed, its surface etched with symbols that shimmered faintly in the lantern light. The air here was thick, heavy with the scent of mold and something else, something older, a smell of decay and forgotten memories. Mr. Hawthorne reached out slowly, his hand trembling as he touched the cold metal of the door. "This is it," he whispered, "the heart of the house, the place where all began." With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, the hinges groaning with the strain. Beyond lay a large, circular room, its walls lined with shelves filled with dusty books, ancient artifacts, and parchments so old they seemed on the verge of disintegration. In the center of the room, a stone pedestal stood, atop it a book, its cover black as night, bound in what appeared to be human skin. Emily gasped, taking a step back, her mind reeling at the sight. "Is that—" "Yes," Mr. Hawthorne nodded, his face pale, "the Book of Shadows, the source of the curse." As they worked, the moaning grew louder, more urgent. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, and the air grew thick with a palpable tension. The house seemed to be reacting to their preparations, the atmosphere charged with a foreboding that made Emily's skin crawl. Once everything was in place, they stood at opposite sides of the circle, the book open between them to a page marked with a dark, crimson bookmark. The ritual required them to recite a chant, one that would supposedly unravel the threads of darkness and light, merging them into one. The words were strange, twisted phrases that felt uncomfortable to speak, as if each syllable was a key turning in an ancient, forbidden lock. They began the chant, their voices echoing in the unnatural stillness of the room. The candles flared as they spoke, their flames reaching high and then dimming, as if breathing in time with their words. The crystals began to glow, a soft, pulsing light that grew steadily brighter with each passing second. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind howled through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. Emily's heart raced. She could hear Mr. Hawthorne's strained breathing from across the circle. They continued the chant, unseeing, guided only by the faint glow of the crystals and the urgent need to complete what they had started. Then, without warning, a scream shattered the silence, a scream so piercing, so filled with agony and despair, that Emily nearly faltered in her recitation. But she pressed on, her voice shaking as she spoke the final words of the ritual. The ground beneath them trembled, the book vibrated on its pedestal, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The wind died down, the room fell silent, and a heavy darkness settled over them, impenetrable and suffocating. In the suffocating darkness that now enveloped them, Emily's senses sharpened. Her ears picked up the faintest sounds, the distant drip of water, the unsettling creak of old wood, and her own heartbeat, thunderous in the eerie silence. Beside her, she could sense Mr. Hawthorne's tense presence, his breathing ragged with fear and anticipation. They waited, suspended in a void where time seemed to stretch and warp, for what felt like an eternity. Then, gradually, the oppressive darkness began to lift, unraveling slowly, as if reluctant to release its hold on the room. As the shadows receded, the crystal's glow intensified, casting a soft, otherworldly light that gradually filled the space. The book on the pedestal remained still, its pages fluttering slightly as if caught in a gentle breeze. The air itself felt different now, lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from the very atmosphere of the house. Emily and Mr. Hawthorne exchanged a look of cautious relief. "Did it work?" Emily's voice broke the silence, her words tentative, almost afraid to shatter the fragile peace that had settled around them. I think it did," Mr. Hawthorne replied, his voice equally unsure. "We should check the house, see if anything has changed." Nodding, Emily followed him out of the room, their footsteps echoing softly in the now quiet corridor. As they ascended the stairs leading back to the main part of the house, a palpable change in the environment greeted them. The air was fresher, the oppressive feeling of being watched, that constant sensation of lurking eyes, was gone. The house, for the first time in decades, felt just like a house. They moved from room to room, their lanterns casting light into corners that had not seen light for years. Everywhere they went, the signs were the same. The heavy, haunted atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a sense of normalcy, of quiet mundane life. When they returned to the attic, the place where Emily had first heard Eliza's piano, they found the instrument still and silent, its keys untouched by ghostly hands. The atmosphere was no longer one of sorrowful melodies, but rather a silent testament to a peace long overdue. Encouraged, they ventured back down to the living room. Here, Emily paused, her eyes drawn to the window where she had often felt watched. Now, looking out, she saw only the garden, its wild overgrowth bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, peaceful and undisturbed. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked, turning to Mr. Hawthorne, who was watching her with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "It seems so," he replied, his voice soft, reflective. "The curse is broken, the spirits released. This house can finally rest, as can they." As they stood there, a sense of accomplishment mixed with an indescribable sadness filled Emily. So much pain and fear had filled these walls, and now, finally, there was peace. She thought of Eliza, of her tragic tale, and of all the others who had suffered under the curse's shadow. They had done it, not just for themselves, but for all the lost souls tied to the Hawthorne estate. Just then, a soft, almost imperceptible melody drifted to their ears. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the tune, Eliza's melody. But this time, the music carried no sorrow, no despair. Instead, it was light, hopeful. A farewell. Turning to Mr. Hawthorne, Emily smiled, a tear trailing down her cheek. "She's free now," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "They all are." "Yes," Mr. Hawthorne agreed, a tear of his own glistening in the dim light. "And it's all thanks to you, Emily." As they left the house, the door closing with a soft, final click behind them, the melody faded away, leaving only the night sounds of Corval. They walked away from the Hawthorne estate, leaving behind the shadows and the ghosts, taking with them the memories of those they had helped release. The night was quiet, the stars bright above them. As they walked down the road leading away from the house, their hearts lighter than when they had arrived, filled with a sense of closure, of ending, and of new beginnings. As Emily and Mr. Hawthorne walked away from the Hawthorne estate, the cool night air seemed to carry with it a sense of renewal, washing away the remnants of fear and dread that had clung to them. The road stretched before them, lined by the silhouettes of trees swaying gently in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets of the night. Yet, as they reached the edge of town, Emily couldn't shake a faint, niggling feeling, a sense that something remained unresolved, a final thread left dangling in the tapestry of their eerie adventure. She paused, looking back towards the mansion that now lay shrouded in the soft moonlight, its dark outline less menacing, yet still imposing. "Do you feel it, Mr. Hawthorne?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The peace, it's real, isn't it?" Mr. Hawthorne nodded, but his eyes betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "Yes, it's real," he replied, but then hesitated. "However, these old houses and their legacies, sometimes they hold on to secrets, secrets so deep not even light can reveal them all at once." Emily pondered his words as they resumed walking. The melody that had bid them farewell at the house returned to her mind, beautiful yet melancholic. It was a reminder that every ending was also a beginning, that every silence spoke as much of the past as it did of the future. Upon reaching Emily's cottage, they agreed to meet the next day, to discuss the possibility of documenting their experiences, to ensure that the stories of those lost souls, and their own encounters, were not forgotten. They parted ways, the night enveloping Mr. Hawthorne as he headed towards his home. Back inside her cottage, Emily sat by the window, a cup of tea in hand, staring into the night. The darkness seemed less oppressive now, the stars brighter, as if the very sky were different. Yet, the sense of an unfinished story tugged at her. Compelled by a force she couldn't explain, Emily grabbed her coat and flashlight, heading back towards the Hawthorne estate. The moon guided her path, casting long shadows on the ground. As she neared the house, the air grew inexplicably colder, a chill that seeped into her bones. The front door of the mansion, which they had closed firmly behind them, stood strangely ajar. Pushing it open, Emily stepped inside, the familiar creak of the hinges echoing through the empty halls. She directed her flashlight ahead, the beam cutting through the darkness. Her heart raced, every instinct telling her that she was not alone. As she reached the living room, the flashlight flickered, then died, leaving her in darkness. A soft piano note broke the silence, followed by another, then a melody, Eliza's melody, but not as they had heard it before. This time it was vibrant, almost triumphant. "Eliza?" Emily called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. In the darkness, a soft glow appeared by the piano. The figure of Eliza materialized, more defined than before, smiling serenely at Emily. "You've returned," she said, her voice clear and melodic like the notes she played. "Why?" Emily asked, stepping closer. "Why am I here again?" Eliza's smile deepened, wise and knowing. "Because some stories never truly end," she replied. "They echo, they resonate, and sometimes they call us back to remind us, to teach us." "What must I learn?" Emily asked, drawn in by Eliza's presence, by the mystery that still lingered. "That every shadow, every light, every note played in this house carries a piece of its soul, and now, a piece of yours," Eliza explained. "You are part of this place, as much as I am, as much as anyone who has ever cared deeply about it." Understanding dawned on Emily, a profound connection to the house and its history, to the spirits she had helped and the stories she had unearthed. "So, what now?" she asked. "Now, you carry the story forward," Eliza said, her figure beginning to fade. "Remember, share, and cherish it. And know that when the night is still and the moon is bright, this melody will play for you, a reminder of what was, what is, and what could be." With those final words, Eliza disappeared, and the melody slowly ebbed away, leaving a silence that was deep and full of meaning. Emily stood there, a sense of peace enveloping her, a peace intertwined with a haunting beauty. She left the house, the door closing softly behind her, the echoes of the piano fading into the night. As she walked back to her cottage, the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and pink. Emily knew she would write about these events, share these stories, ensuring that the legacy of the Hawthorne estate, its shadows, and its lights, would never be forgotten. The melody lingered in her mind, a haunting yet beautiful symphony of the past, a continuous reminder that in every ending, there lies a new beginning.